Okay, Louise.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll call this hearing to order. Chairman Sessions will be with us in just a bit, but he asked me to get things started. The Rules Committee today will focus on four bills. S-1094, the Department of Veterans Affairs Accountability and Whistleblower Protection Act, which honors the sacrifices of our former military men and women by ensuring they are provided with the high-quality care and benefits that they've earned. It follows up on a House-passed bill from earlier this year that makes it easier for VA leaders to discipline or fine employees who are derelict in their duties. It also strengthens whistleblower protections for those brave VA employees who come forward to expose the wrongdoing. S-1094 passed the Senate by a voice vote, and I hope we'll be able to follow suit on that success here. H.R. 2372, the Veteran Act, is sponsored by my good friend Representative Sam Johnson, and I'm proud to say that I'm a co-sponsor of that bill. It corrects a flaw in current law and one that unfortunately had to be continued in the AHCA given the constraints of reconciliation. The bill before us today ensures that individuals who are eligible for VA health care but who are not enrolled are also eligible for tax credit assistance in purchasing an individual health insurance plan. The Department of Treasury has already provided an exception to the law so that this can happen today, but H.R. 2372 would codify the IRS's current interpretation of the law to ensure our veterans have the same choices that all other Americans do. H.R. 2579, the Broader Options for Americans Act, would also fix a loophole in the AHCA that only exists because of another constraint of reconciliation. Representative Pat Teaberry introduced this bill to ensure that folks who are paying for COBRA health insurance coverage are allowed to receive the refundable advanceable credit that is provided for in the AHCA for any unsubsidized COBRA payments. Again, this is an issue of fairness. If you're doing the right thing, maintaining your health insurance coverage, then the federal government should treat you just like it does every other person who is buying their own health insurance. And finally, we have H.R. 2581, the Verify First Act. This is a good governance bill that seeks to ensure that every taxpayer dollar going out the door to fund the AHCA's refundable tax credits is going to someone who is legally eligible to receive it. While the ACA and the AHCA both state that only individuals who are legally in the United States are eligible for health insurance tax credits, existing IRS procedures are not adequate to ensure that outcome. Whether you support or oppose the AHCA, the fact of the matter is that we need to prioritize the appropriate use of American taxpayer dollars only for those who are legally eligible to receive them. I know that talking about health care can elicit some strong opinions on both sides, but I hope that we can all agree that those targeted improvements that we are considering today are warranted and should receive a strong bipartisan support. With that, I will turn to our distinguished ranking member, Ms. Slaughter, for any comments she may have.
I do have an opening statement. Thank you very much for allowing me to do it. And I am going to disagree with you a little bit. I don't think, well, maybe a lot. I don't know what we're doing. I think this bill is beyond repair, and I think everybody in the country has pretty much pointed that out. So now we're going to try to change it a little bit. I understand this is the first of two meetings this week for your third step in the health care repeal strategy. First, the majority passed their disastrous health care repeal bill, I think, last month after drafting it somewhere. Second, the Health and Human Service Secretary has already begun, illegally, I believe, using administrative measures to undermine the Affordable Care Act, which is absolutely the law of the land. And we have the scars to prove it, don't we, Rich? So that brings us to today and the majority's so-called third bucket of legislative fixes. And I want to be as clear as I can, Mr. Chairman, no amount of patches will fix this bucket. You don't have to take my word for it. Senator Cruz said, and I quote, "I have called the bucket 3 the suckers bucket," end quote. Senator Cotton has called this process, quote, "politicians engaging in spin," end quote. Now, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office found that the repeal bill would kick 23 million Americans off their insurance, including 14 million people in the first year alone. I think it's going to come as a surprise to them as well, because I don't think that's so well known. It also would gut the protections for people with pre-existing conditions and making health care for me. But there's another portion of this that we don't talk about at all. And certainly I'm surprised. We understand that you want to pass the health care bill first because you want $880 billion out of Medicaid coming out of the health care bill. And that money is to pay for the corporate tax cuts and the tax cuts for the top percent. In the first place, I can't see how you would ever justify taking the money away from health care for the poor people so that you could give it in corporate tax money. It's pretty bad. And we all understand, I think we do, that the majority of Medicaid money is used for people in nursing homes. Isn't that correct? If that's so, shouldn't you be telling them now before the 4th of July that they're going to have to take mom or dad home or make some kind of other arrangements for them when they can't pay for the nursing home? So, and then on top of that money, the $880 billion, the Trump budget calls for another $610 billion in cuts to Medicaid. And I have noted that a number of senators on both sides of the aisle said that won't work. Despite impacting 1/6 of our economy, the bill was rushed through the House without a single hearing, any input from experts, or a score from the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. And I was particularly distressed to read today that your colleagues on the other side of the Capitol are taking this process to a whole new level by sending their repeal bill with CBO without even releasing it first, in addition to skipping the committee process. If reports of a vote before the 4th of July recess are correct, that means the public may not even see this bill until the week the Senate votes on it. And if it should pass both houses, we said before, people had better be looking at how they're going to be paying nursing home bills. One Senate Republican aide defended this by saying, quote, "We're not stupid," end quote. You've all seen the protests, you've heard the phone calls, you've read the letters against it. You know how unpopular this repeal is, but you're moving ahead just to fulfill a political talking point. I would be happy if, even though you told us 60 times that you already had a bill to replace ready, and that turned out to be far from the truth, I would forgive you all that and let us work together to try to bring what we all think needs to be done to make the ACA acceptable. This would make much more sense and frankly would bring back the old days of what we used to do in the House of Representatives. So we have a bad process and a bad product, and I don't think anything we're going to do here today will change that. So thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it very much, and I yield back.
I will accept the gentlelady's invitation to work together on solutions, and for that purpose, I have invited two of the very finest minds in Congress to help us do that. Mr. Brady is chairman, and Mr. Neal representing the... I heard you say you wanted to work on solutions together. Just particular solutions, not any solutions. No. We welcome any written testimony that you all have. We'll certainly submit that and have that printed in the record, and we would recognize each of you for any verbal statements you might have, beginning with the chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Slaughter, members of the Rules Committee. Thanks for allowing me to testify in support of these important bills. Each piece of legislation under consideration today is an important part of our ongoing effort to repeal Obamacare and replace this failing law with the 21st century healthcare system that truly works for the American people. As we've said from the beginning, repealing and replacing Obamacare must be a thoughtful, step-by-step process. With the House passage of the American Health Care Act, we are well on our way to delivering relief to the American people, relief that could not come soon enough as Obamacare continues to implode. The American Health Care Act provides a strong and stable foundation for a healthcare system based on the needs of patients and families, not Washington. As the Senate now considers the American Health Care Act, we're pushing forward on a parallel track to deliver additional solutions that will improve healthcare in America. All three of the bills under consideration today are focused on this crucial goal. First is the Veteran Act, sponsored by Congressman Sam Johnson. As the chairman said, this bill takes action to ensure continued access to private health insurance options for the men and women who, like Mr. Johnson himself, have served and sacrificed in defense of our great nation. The bill puts into law an existing regulation which allows veterans who are eligible for, but aren't enrolled yet, in VA healthcare to access tax credits offered under current law and the tax credits provided by the American Health Care Act when they take place. In effect, this will provide our veterans with financial support and greater flexibility to access health plans that best meet their needs. Our second bill is the Broader Options for Americans Act, sponsored by Congressman Pat Tiberi. This bill expands financial support for the purchase of health insurance for certain Americans who've lost their group coverage, often because they've lost their job. This bill allows these Americans who are eligible for COBRA continuation coverage, that is, people facing higher costs and no direct financial support from their employer, allows them to access the American Health Care Act's tax credit. Additionally, it ensures that Americans who have similar continuation coverage and worked at churches, other houses of worship, can also access these credits. Finally, we have the Verify First Act, sponsored by Congressman Lou Barletta, Pennsylvania. This legislation takes action to protect taxpayer dollars from waste, fraud, and abuse. It prevents the American Health Care Act's monthly tax credits and Obamacare's current subsidies from being dispensed until the legal status of an eligible recipient can be verified. The Verify First Act strengthens existing verification tools by making a common sense change. Rather than sending the money first and checking legal status later, which Obamacare does now, this verifies legal status up front. As we've seen with so many federal programs, it's all but impossible to get fraudulently claimed money back after it's already out the door. The best solution is to stop waste, fraud, and abuse of taxpayer dollars before it occurs, and that's exactly what this bill does. Closing, I want to recognize the hard work and leadership of Congressman Johnson, Tiberi, and Barletta. These bills are important solutions to improve health care in America and safeguard our taxpayer dollars. And all three of them move us closer to repealing and replacing Obamacare for the American people. Again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the committee, for allowing me to testify today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Slaughter, as well. Before I discuss the bills, let me step back and connect the dots for my colleagues as to how we got here. Last month, Republicans brought Trump care to the House floor and passed it with every Democrat opposed. This was the Republican leadership's second attempt to pass the repeal. Their first attempt seems to me to have apparently not have been harmful enough so that they went back and developed legislation that was even more harmful to the American people. The measure, as passed, takes health insurance away from millions of Americans, raises premiums for working families, and places an age tax on older Americans. Middle-class Americans would end up on the losing end, while millionaires and billionaires would receive a handsome, nearly $1 trillion tax cut. And that's really why the baseline was changed. Perhaps most concerning is that members voted in favor of this legislation without understanding its impact on the American people. So institutionally, this is something we just might want to give a couple of moments of thought to. We're asked today to offer amendments to a piece of legislation that has already left the House. So, I mean, the way to best address that is perhaps, why don't we bring it all back to the House and let's try this again? And I think that you would find that there would be a very different outcome given once the American people were able to find out precisely what was in the legislation, or for that matter, what was not in the legislation. There were no hearings on Trump care. Amendments were rushed to the floor without committee consideration, and the CBO score was not available at the time that the House considered it. CBO, based on long career service here, provides corridors for members of Congress. It gives an opportunity for members of Congress to actually look at the long-term result and ramifications of what we might be acting on. Clearly, that was not adhered to in this process. Now, the bills before us are remnants of promises that Republican leadership has made to their caucus in an effort to twist arms to get the votes to pass Trump care. We all should be appalled that the House has ignored important procedures when considering these important measures. First, since the Republican repeal bill passed, the CBO numbers confirmed that the measure would leave 23 million Americans without health insurance, cut Medicaid by more than $800 billion, discriminate against individuals with pre-existing conditions, and drastically raise premiums for older Americans. Simply put, healthcare would force Americans to pay more for lower quality health coverage. Second, two of the bills we are considering today are not appropriate to consider at this time because they would only amend the Trump Care bill that has not passed the Senate. Now, let me turn to the substantive concerns that we might have before the Rules Committee today. H.R. 2372 would amend the AHCA to allow veterans not enrolled in military-related coverage to receive tax credits. It does nothing to fix the issues in Trump Care that would shift costs onto veterans through per capita caps, roll back Medicaid expansion for veterans, and erode essential health benefits and pre-existing condition protections. The Republican health plan would dramatically cut Medicaid, a program that provides health care for 2 million veterans. And the President's recently passed budget makes it even more complicated, and it's a step backwards again because it cuts veterans programs, including disability benefits. H.R. 2579 would allow individuals purchasing COBRA coverage to receive tax credits. Anybody who's tried to pay for COBRA, you know the reality that we're up against. But older Americans are more likely to depend upon it, and the Republican Trump Care bill would allow insurers to charge older Americans up to 5 times what they charge younger Americans. These tax credits would not make COBRA coverage any more affordable for older Americans. And finally, H.R. 2581 would essentially address a non-existent problem regarding Social Security numbers. However, it would make it more difficult for certain Americans, infants and domestic violence victims, to acquire health coverage. This bill requires individuals to complete identity authentication by providing a Social Security number and disallowing the use of the individual taxpayer identification number, incidentally, before receiving any advanceable tax credit established by the AHCA, along with advanced premium tax credits provided under current law. It would create barriers for eligible individuals to access tax credits, disproportionately hurt children and vulnerable groups, and ignore existing procedures that prevent ineligible individuals from receiving tax credits. Even if all 3 of these bills were incorporated into Trump Care legislation, they would not undo the terrible cuts in this bill. Enormous coverage losses, more than $800 billion in cuts to Medicaid, unraveling of important consumer protections, or cuts to programs designed to help address the opiate addiction issue, which in my state of Massachusetts is in crisis, as recognized by Governor Baker. I'm quite sure everyone in this room has someone close to them addicted to opiates, and in addition, Medicaid is now a program that many middle-class Americans rely on for long-term care. Ms. Slaughter correctly referenced the following: 60 cents of every dollar from Medicaid now goes to long-term nursing home care. So thanks to Medicare and Medicaid, your parents are not living in your attic. These bills do nothing to fix the Republican repeal measure and could create new problems. The submission that we should be talking about today is how to improve the Affordable Care Act. Instead, we've come up with a piece of legislation that has had very little opportunity to go under the microscope of critical analysis, and we should be working together to fix this legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman for his testimony. Mr. Chairman, I am looking here at the Veteran Act, the Broader Options for Americans Act, and the Verify First Act. The committee held markups on each of these pieces of legislation. The thinking about the testimony from Mr. Neal, I understand that folks don't like the Affordable Health Care Act on one side of the aisle any more than I don't like.
I knew you were a perceptive
the
man.
ACA on the other side. You know, you folks say it enough, I'm able to pick it up. That said, from reading the dissenting views here in the report, it looks like we all agree with Sam Johnson. I know he's someone that everyone on this panel respects. We all agree with him that to the extent that the AHCA becomes the law of the land, this is a fix that needs to happen and that we would collectively support, notwithstanding your opposition to the underlying legislation. And am I reading the dissenting views correctly that if this is the law of the land, we should do this for veterans in it?
Mr. Chairman, at the moment, it's very difficult for us to put our arms around anything. The Affordable Care Act was done without any opportunity, the American Health Care Act was done without any opportunity for markups, amendments, and the normal procedure that we generally refer to as the regular order here. And now we understand that there's this effort made in the Senate, which, again, there won't be a markup, by the way, in the Senate. That's my understanding. And so we're being asked to amend a bill that's left the House. So I think on the basis of precedent and procedure, we object.
I have come to find great comfort in those times where I feel like we're together on the ideas, even if we're not together on the process. Sometimes getting together on process is hard. Sometimes getting together on ideas is hard. Looking at what you all in the committee did for men and women with COBRA, looking for what you all did with the committee for our veterans, comforts me that we're all on the same page in terms of how it is we should serve people. Process notwithstanding, and I thank
Might
you
I,
for
Mr.
that.
Chairman?
Please.
From the time that I've been here, process is the holy grail of legislative life, because the minority always understands that they might be in the majority, but more importantly, the majority comes to understand that eventually they could be in the minority. So process was something that we all agreed to at one time.
To the gentleman's point, I remember a cold day in March where a bill was jammed through the United States House that had never received a hearing or a markup. It was jammed through exactly as the Senate had passed it on Christmas Eve 3 months earlier, and then a secondary bill had to be passed to fix all the problems that was done. I take the gentleman's point that such a process rarely works out for the benefit of us all. The gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you. I don't have much in the way of questions because I think these are three very solid pieces of legislation. I appreciate you, Chairman, bringing them before us, and I recognize my friend Mr. Neal's concern. I think that's a legitimate concern, but we're in an unusual circumstances with all due respect to my friends. I don't think they were going to be working with us on this bill no matter what. So arguing for a process when there are no votes in the process, I think somewhat I recognize it. I've been there before myself, but I don't think it really changes the outcome very much. I do want to make a couple of points just in passing, though. You know, in my state, I can tell you what we already have passed is better than what we have. Now, I'm going to ask you, Mr. Brady, is Texas a Medicaid expansion state?
No, sir.
Neither is Oklahoma. And, you know, we have a lot of interesting statistics from the Congressional Budget Office. Some of those people that supposedly are losing health care are in Texas because they're supposed to be on Medicaid expansion, except they're not. But someday they will be. And then so we get to count them as people who've lost insurance. I mean, that's the most ridiculous thing ever. I wouldn't speak to the politics of Texas, but I can just tell you in Oklahoma, it's very unlikely that Obamacare as written would ever be accepted by the state. It just will not happen. That's the political reality. We can debate the policy. They're in the middle of a budget crisis themselves right now because of low commodity prices, and they at no point do they think they would be in a position to pay the match, even though this is an exceptionally generous match as originally written by the federal government, and they have very little faith that that 90-10 split would be sustained. They think that it would move toward the mean, which is roughly $2 federal money for every dollar of state, although that varies by states pretty dramatically. So I suspect in Texas as in Oklahoma, because you're not a Medicaid expansion state, and that's a decision you made for state reasons, but your hospitals are caring for a lot of patients that they're not getting compensated for. That's certainly happening in Oklahoma. Under the Republican bill, we'll be better off. We literally, our hospitals will be better off because there will be money for them. We're down, I don't know what it is in Texas, we're down to a single provider in Oklahoma. That provider's been losing money. We think what happened in Iowa, where 94 of 99 counties no longer have coverage, or Tennessee, where I think 16 counties are now losing it, is about to happen to us, or could easily happen to us in the relatively near future. So a tax credit versus nothing you can purchase at all looks better. We'd like to incentivize people. So we think the product, the first product was better. We think it got better in negotiation. We're content to let the Senate continue to work on these issues and see what they come up with. I'm very interested because I frankly have a lot of confidence in people like Senator Alexander, a serious legislator over there, who play a key role. But we'll see. In the meantime, there's no sense waiting around and not moving to make some obvious fixes here. I think that's actually the responsible thing to do. And I want to commend you and your committee for doing that. Again, kind of hard for me to argue against Sam Johnson on anything related to veterans. Hard for me to disagree that we ought to make it easier for people to sustain COBRA coverage when they're caught in those situations. I've been caught in one of those situations in my lifetime. Very grateful that COBRA existed, but it was certainly tough to fund it for a few months. And then verify list, making sure that people that are using benefits that are paid for by American taxpayers are actually eligible to do that seems pretty common sense to me. So I just want to thank you for your good work. I thank you for continuing to try and address this knotty issue, because I can tell you, in my state at least, and I only speak for my state, the current system is not sustainable, will not last. We will find ourselves without coverage pretty quickly, and our hospitals are already hurting in the way that this thing has been structured. So again, standpoint of my state, this is a pretty easy sell, the original Republican bill. The 3 additions you're making here make it that much more attractive. So that, yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from New York.
No questions. I'll be down for my statement. Thank you very much.
Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to associate myself with the comments of Mr. Cole. Texas and Oklahoma, obviously both non-expansion states. We've just come through our budgeting process in our state legislative session. Under current law, under the Affordable Care Act, Texas will lose almost $2 billion in disproportionate share funding come October 1st, the start of the new fiscal year. I think it's imperative that we do work on fixing the failing prospect that is before us in the Affordable Care Act. And certainly, Chairman Brady, I thank you for the work that you've done in this arena. I think the changes that you've brought to us today are important. I think they're worthwhile. 2 million people, almost 2 million people lost their coverage under the Affordable Care Act, according to a CMS report that was put out just today. They lost this year, and they didn't lose it because of something that happened in the Ways and Means Committee or the Energy and Commerce Committee or even the Rules Committee. They lost it because they didn't pay their premium after they signed up. So you had nearly 2 million fewer people actually pay the premium than selected an Affordable Care Act plan, which tells me it's probably not affordable. It's high time we did something about this. I'm grateful that we're doing it. And Chairman Brady, I thank you for bringing these bills to our attention today. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the gentleman very much. Judge Hastings.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank both the distinguished gentlemen that are here. Let me first refer specifically to 2372, the Veterans Equal Treatment Insurers Relief and Access Now Act. Mr. Neal, is it true that the reason we are considering this bill is because Republicans stripped the provision that protects veterans' premium tax credits out of so-called Trump care so that they could fast-track their plan?
That's correct.
Then let me turn to you, Mr. Chairman. When you brought your final version of Trump care to the floor in May, were you aware of the consequences of stripping out the provision protecting veterans' premium tax credits?
So, thank you, Mr. Hastings. So what I'm aware of is the Washington Post fact-checked that claim that 7 million veterans will lose their tax credit on the GOP health bill and gave it 3 Pinocchios because it's simply not true. The current treatment continues, although it is done by regulation in current practice. We want to ensure veterans are guaranteed access to their health care by doing it in law. So we simply codify what is the current regulatory practice to ensure that going forward, that isn't a decision made by any administration, that is a guarantee by members of the U.S. Congress.
So then were you aware that you were stripping out the provision protecting veterans?
But we are aware that current practice should be made law, which
Yes.
is why this bill is in front of you.
So when it left here, did it have what you're doing in it now?
And so because in the reconciliation process, not all provisions can be passed through the Senate parliamentarians' approach. And so we opted
You're
to
talking about
stay-
the Byrd rule.
Yeah, so we're opted to stay with the current regulation in that bill, but made it clear that we will, as members of Congress, bring this forward as a law. In the Ways and Means Committee, I may be wrong, but the discussions by our Democrat friends were in support of making this law, but opposed to the process and the underlying bill. I may be wrong, but I thought there was very strong support for our veterans having this codified in law.
Mr. Neal?
The cuts to Medicaid, as currently prescribed in the AHCA, would be harmful to 2 million veterans in America who receive a Medicaid benefit.
Are there other problems that exist with reference to this matter that haven't been discovered that you know of, Mr. Brady?
I'm sorry, Mr.
Are there other problems that exist, other consequences that may require this kind of fix?
Well, as you know, Obamacare itself didn't protect veterans in law. The bill you voted for didn't do that. This law does do that, codified in law.
What I'm
Now,
asking you is, do you
may
know of
choose
any other-
Not to give veterans that protection, but I actually think this is a bipartisan measure.
So you still haven't answered my question. My question is, do you know of any other potential consequences of a fix, regardless of who is at fault for it not having been undertaken?
Well, I think, one, I challenge that description of it, but clearly, unless there is opposition to a law that codifies the regulations, that unlike Obamacare, ensures our veterans have access to these health care credits for their needs if they're not enrolled in VA, I think this is a very positive step forward.
All right. Mr. Brady, I was resisting doing what I do all the time when all these 62 times, or maybe 63 times that we voted to repeal Obamacare. When we started out, people weren't calling it that, but at some point or another, including Obama, he finally adopted it, since everybody kept saying it. But I perceived it as nastiness, quite frankly. It left here the Affordable Health Care Act. That's what we voted for, and the truth of the matter is, if we drill down, we probably could have called it, and y'all might have liked it better, Pelosi Care, in terms of who did the work. But I want all y'all to know that I advocated universal health care before I knew Barack Obama's name. And so I've been fond of saying perhaps we should have called it Hastings Obamacare, since,
We're open to that, Mr. Hastings.
yeah, well, I can
Hastings Obama Brady
I can assure you we would have had a better plan, and I can also assure you we are ultimately going to get to universal health care. And toward that end, let me ask you this. Do you believe that Medicare that passed in 1965 is a good program for Americans?
Oh, I do. In fact, that's why Republicans have championed two of the major improvements, Medicare Advantage, that's the most popular plan for our seniors today, and the prescription drug plan that's now in law, which is highly popular, that helps seniors with their prescription costs rather than sending them to a hospital.
Why couldn't we do Medicare for all and get it over with?
Well, frankly, we can get into this debate, but here we have an important program that more than 50 million seniors depend upon that is financially shaky. We have to work together, Republicans and Democrats, to save that important program for all Americans. And so separate from this vote on whether veterans should be guaranteed by law coverage for these credits, we ought to have that discussion on how we best save Medicare for the long term.
Mr. Neal?
Well, I think that you raise a great point, and Kevin referenced it. When you suggest that Part D, the prescription drug benefit, if you recall, we opposed it on the Democratic side, Judge, because of the donut hole. You had to spend down X number of dollars before the benefit kicked in. And so what was the first thing that we did in 2006? We fixed it. Fixed the donut hole. And with fixing the donut hole, everybody breathed a sigh of relief, cheered, moved on. Nobody even talks about that anymore. if we had used that precedent by way of example as to how we should have proceeded with the ACA, then we would be able to fix that as well.
Right. And I continue to, it's been pointed out here by my friend from Texas, that Texas and Oklahoma were non-expansion states. All of that was rank politics when the deal goes down. By not expanding, it was what we have today that is referenced often, that this, the Affordable Health Care Act is imploding. I want to make it very clear, I don't think Republicans are going to be held harmless as we go forward for what they have done in an effort to make sure that it was not successful. I felt in my state that it was the most backward thing in all the 80 years that I'm on earth to see us leave 900,000 people in the lurch by not expanding Medicaid. It absolutely makes no sense. So then, just one final comment, and I don't mean it to be facetious, but a lot of y'all in here in Congress rushed over to the White House, had this big celebration that we had repealed Obamacare. And I witnessed it, and I laughed, because I know and knew then that we had not done all that was necessary. And let me reference again 1965 and Medicare. It took a while to tool what transpired. So whatever it is you ultimately pass, it's going to take some time to ultimately fix it. And the simple fact of the matter is, if we were working together, we would be better advised. Let me yield to the gentlelady.
Thank you. I just wanted to say, Mr. Hastings, in regard to this being the Pelosi-Hastings-Obama bill, it's 67% popular with the populations of the United States.
Well,
We don't often see something like that, and an awful lot of people are terrified of what's going to happen to them.
and my final comment is this. While we continue, well, before that, let me ask you, Mr. Brady, have you seen the Senate proposal?
No, nor would I.
Do you know when we will see it?
Well, I know Leader McConnell is pushing hard to get this done this summer, and I can certainly refer you to his statements.
Mr. Neal, a moment ago, made the comment that he hesitated by saying he's not sure that they're not going to have a mock-up. Do you know whether or not there's going to be a mock-up?
I would refer you to the Senate as they work through their process.
So as we go forward, what you're saying to me here is that it's all over there and that you, as the chairman of Ways and Means, don't have any discussions about what they're
Oh,
going
no,
to do?
I didn't say that. You were asking
Well,
a
tell me about
specific
it then.
timetable. What would you like to know, Mr. Hastings?
I'd like to know how often you're talking with them and why it is that Mr. Neal, for example, can't be invited to the same discussions that you're having. We're America here.
And because we're America is why we're proposing these three bills today.
I
In our
see.
discussion with the Senate, unlike Obamacare, we want to guarantee coverage for veterans for this credit. We want to make sure those who are pushed into COBRA, usually because their jobs have been taken away, have coverage as well. And why we want to make sure these precious dollars for health care aren't lost to fraud and abuse.
We play so many games here.
Yeah.
You know, I guess if we were talking single payer, we would have a discussion that it is socialized medicine. And here we are talking about veterans measures, and rightly so. And I guess that's not socialized somehow or another. It seems to me that what we need to understand is that people are hurting in this country. And not just in some states that didn't expand Medicaid, but in all of our states, there are people who are uncertain. And it isn't the insurance companies that are at fault totally for not wanting to run additional risks. Our failure to do the subsidies that were in the Affordable Health Care Act are part of it, and you're responsible, your party, for much of that. So we'll continue down this path. I suspect we'll be back here sometime soon. But I want you to know that while we are fiddling, that there are people in this country who are hurting. And they are hurting in many ways. And you continue down this road of looking for tax cuts for those that are better off in our society and leaving those who are more vulnerable left behind. You do yourselves a terrible disservice, and you do our country a terrible disservice. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Judge Hastings. I think it's important to note that we're really not trying to run back through the health care plan, but let me just be point blank about this, that if you work a part-time job and you are offered health care by your company and you turn it down because it's too expensive, you cannot even buy into what's known as Obamacare. Well, what I'm saying is that's no wonder people are hurting today. So what would happen, Judge, is presumptively under the process that we're going through, and we're going to refine it, trust me, what will happen is that people will be given an opportunity to have tax credits as an opportunity to get the health care that they would choose to. And you know that's up to $14,000 for a family. And the average family would be $8,000. Yes, sir.
Just the premise that you began
Yes, sir.
with, stick a tack in it, and we'll get a chance to talk about it because I think you were wrong.
Well, that's my point. That's my point. We're sitting here pontificating about something that is really not the subject of today, but it's generic to that, and I appreciate the gentleman. But even what we did pass, there were $14,000 worth of tax credits for families in there to go purchase health care regardless of their income. And I think that that is simply a way to look at it. So we're not high and dry, either one of us. But we do both live in glass houses, and you and I have admitted that a lot. And I appreciate the gentleman's comments. Thank you very much. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins does not seek time. The gentleman from Alabama does not seek time. The gentleman from Washington, Mr. Newhouse. Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate having the two, what was it, the two greatest minds in the, or something like that in the Congress here today to talk about this.
We're not going to, I was afraid we're going to fact check that one. So.
Well, I'm sure that's happening as we speak. But thank you for coming here and discussing these three bills that are important to what I think has been pretty common knowledge from the, at least our leadership's point of view and communication with how this process would work. The reconciliation is one bucket. The things that the administration, the department can do is another bucket. And then we have bills that can be passed to, that would not pass through the Byrd rule in a third bucket. And that's, I think, if my understanding is correct, is what we're doing here today.
Yes, sir.
To help make better the American Health Care Act. And so I appreciate your efforts to do that. There was some, and I wasn't taking close enough notes, Mr. Neal, but you made some comments about this, the VET Act, I believe, that were, it sounded to me like it was actually going to make things worse for veterans. Could you repeat that? And then I'd like to,
My
if I
suggestion
could just
is-
ask Mr. Brady to respond to that.
Oh, okay, and I'll follow up if it's okay.
Well, no, if you could repeat your complaints, and then I wanted to
My
have that
complaint
discussion
is-
between the two.
My complaint is the following, that if you proceed with the cuts, draconian cuts that have been offered to Medicaid, we're reminded that there are 2 million veterans that receive a Medicaid benefit in America.
Okay. So that was the basis of what your problem was. Mr. Brady, would you?
Well, yeah, under the American Health Care Act that passed the House, Medicaid continues to grow. Today it's roughly $460 billion. It grows to over $500 billion over the 10-year period. But I think most importantly, the American Health Care Act that passed this provides states with several $100 billion to be able to focus, as opposed to Obamacare, focus health care on those who need it, whether it is veterans who are poor, perhaps, and homeless, those who have higher medical costs than others, which often they do because of their sometimes multiple deployments, or in the case of the Vietnam-era veterans, are not just now needing those extra healthcare treatments, that up to today they haven't needed. And because of the way Obamacare was designed, which was to try to trick younger people into paying more, which they wisely figured out, now under Obamacare, our seniors, those 50 to 64-year-olds, have seen higher increases in their costs. We sent this committee, Rules Committee, approved an amendment to send an additional $90 billion to help veterans who were in that age group that would have higher health care costs. So my argument would be we made awfully important steps to address veterans care. And this bill, as opposed to Obamacare, which did not codify it, this bill puts it into law, the law of the land that says members of Congress want veterans to be guaranteed access to health insurance going forward.
Okay, yeah, appreciate that. Thank you for that response. We can talk back and forth and take different sides and pontificate about different aspects but I think everybody's trying to do the right thing. And what I see, and I've looked at this very closely, the whole bill and some of the perfections that we're trying to make, my take is that we're actually trying to preserve the original intent of the Medicaid program for those people that most need it. And so I appreciate your efforts on what I think furthers that kind of work. And I think what we're all trying to do is make sure those that are least able to take care of themselves, that we have some ability to give them assistance. Unlike some of the previous speakers, my state is an expansion state. The state of Washington, I think probably, I guess if we could look at it objectively, has one of the more successful exchanges. But in 2018, there's going to be 2 of our counties that are going to end up with no insurers offering plans under the exchange. We have, I think, we'll have half a dozen counties that only have 1. So our counties are beginning to join that long list of counties throughout the country that have fewer and fewer, and in some cases, no options if they're looking at the exchange for coverage. So I applaud the efforts of all of you that have been working so hard on this, all of Congress, and looking at how we can provide the best possible coverage for the most Americans that so much needed. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the time. And
Thank you, gentlemen. Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Windsor, Colorado. The gentleman does not seek time. The gentlewoman from does not seek time. Okay. I want to thank both of you, not only for being here today, but for your abject, really interest in this issue. As each of us knows, this is something that's got to be accomplished one way or another. And I will tell you, the United States Senate is going to take their whack at it. We fully expect, as the young chairman from Ways and Means Committee said, that we anticipate that will be done in the summer, by the summer. And I want to thank both of you. To answer the question, there will be revisions to it. There will be additions. There were some limitations as a result of what Chairman Brady said, what was referred to as the birding or bird rule, and working around that. And it became an important piece for us to understand, so that the bill that went over was not outright excluded from their consideration. So we tried to be cautious and careful with that. If you'll please make sure that whatever you brought today in writing, that our stenographer gets an opportunity, our awesome stenographer gets an opportunity to receive that information. I thank both of you very much. Thank you, Chairman. Yes, sir. It's my understanding that gentleman, Mr. T-Berry, was to appear today and evidently was covered by Mr. Brady. And I want to thank Mr. Brady for doing that. Is there any other member that would seek to give testimony, H.R. 2581, H.R. 2579, or H.R. 2372? Seeing none, this will now close the hearing portion, and we will now open up the second panel, S. 1094, Department of Veterans Affairs Accountability and Whistleblower Protection Act of 2017. I noticed the distinguished gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Waltz, is here. Tim, we welcome you. And would, as we do, I hope each time you come to the Rules Committee, not only recognize but thank you for your service as the senior enlisted officer of the United States military or Navy? In the military. Oh, excuse me, Army. And I want to thank you very, very much for that service. We also welcome the distinguished young chairman of the Veterans Affairs Committee, the gentleman, Dr. Rowe from Knoxville, Tennessee. Gentlemen, you've already heard it. We're delighted that you're here. Anything you brought in writing will be entered in the record without objection, and we're going to move forward. Dr. Rowe, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Slaughter. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify today on Senate Bill 1094, the Department of Veterans Affairs Accountability and Whistleblower Protection Act of 2017. And Mr. Chairman, I want to say it's been a privilege to work with the ranking member. You got two Army guys sitting here, and that shows that we didn't have to work with a Marine, so that made it a lot easier, I think. As I said when I was here in March testifying about my bill, much of which is included in the Senate's bill, it's no secret that a major problem plaguing the Department of Veterans Affairs is the lack of accountability. In fact, both President Trump and Secretary Shulkin have repeatedly called on Congress to pass legislation to make it easier for them to hold VA employees accountable, and I'm proud of the bipartisan, bicameral product the House is considering this week. This legislation is a promise kept to our nation's heroes. The Department of Veterans Affairs Accountability and Whistleblower Protection Act of 2017 would provide the Secretary of the Department of Veterans Affairs with yet another tool to instill accountability at VA by giving him the authority to expeditiously remove, demote, or suspend any VA employee for poor performance or misconduct. This bill also preserves VA employees' due process rights, an issue I know was raised by our friends on the other side of the aisle during the House debate. As I mentioned earlier, this bill is heavily modeled off my bill, H.R. 1259, which passed out of the House with bipartisan support earlier this Congress. In fact, I worked closely with Senators Isaacson, Tester, and Rubio on this bill to ensure it was something we could support in the House. The bill before you today makes a few changes to the House bill, including it adds more time for an employee's appeal to be considered. 2, it reinstitutes employees' ability to grieve a disciplinary action through the collective bargaining agreements, but would bind the arbitrators to the same procedures, timelines, and standards required of appeals made to the Merit System Protection Board, as included in the bill. Creates a new Office of Accountability and Whistleblower Protection, similar to the office created by the President's executive order earlier this year to protect those who blow the whistle on wrongdoing at the department. It adds new whistleblower training for supervisors and requires reports on methods used to investigate VA employees and the outcomes and effectiveness of disciplinary action. This bill would also authorize the Secretary to recoup bonuses and relocation expenses from VA employees when necessary, and would authorize the Secretary to recoup a portion of an employee's retirement benefits if they are convicted of a felony that influenced their work performance. Finally, the bill would provide the Secretary with direct hiring authority for VA network and medical center directors. This is much needed. This has been the request of the former and current administrations and would make it easier for Secretary Shulkin to fill these important positions. This bill has strong support of over a dozen national veterans groups counting. Both my committee and the Senate committee have worked closely with Secretary Shulkin and his team for several months to craft the bill before you today, and I'm proud to have the administration's endorsement of this important piece of legislation. As I've said many times, Dr. Shulkin is someone who garnered trust and respect of two presidents from two different parties to serve our veterans. I hope that my colleagues understand that his support and assistance in crafting the bill before us today is bringing real accountability to the Department of Veterans Affairs is a veteran issue and not a political issue. No effort toward real wholesale reform at the VA will ever be successful absent a strong culture of accountability first. In closing, I ask that this committee provide a closed rule for consideration of this bill so we can quickly send this bill straight to the President's desk. I thank you all once again for inviting me here to testify today on both of these bills. For your dedication to Americans' veterans. And I'm happy to answer any questions. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Rowe, thank you very much. Mr. Picano, I'm going to advise the gentleman, I'm going to add you to this panel. And if for some reason I inadvertently did not include you in the beginning, I apologize. I thought you were on your own panel. and I want to thank the gentleman for taking time to be with us. I do not know who would presume to go next. I will let you, the gentleman from Minnesota, is recognized.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman,
Yes,
and Ranking Member, and to all members of the committee. Thank you for your work up here. And I have to say, every time we come up here, and it's with my good friend and my chairman, Dr. Rowe, I hope we bring you some optimism of what could be done. This is an important piece of legislation. This is not easy stuff. This is the second largest agency in the federal government. It's an issue that is at the center of many Americans' lives and things they care about. This dealt with everything from accountability. It dealt with collective bargaining rights. It dealt with deep philosophical differences on what the role of public sector unions are and how they work. And the chairman brought that forward with a dignity, with a passion, all with the focus that this bill was meant to provide better care and better accountability to this nation's veterans. And that is something that I think I said many times, I think could be modeled in other areas, because no one's questioning anyone's commitment on veterans. It's how we go about doing that. So you heard a little bit about this. It is true we need accountability. And I think all of us, that's not code word for something, and that's not code word to fire everybody, and that's not code word to break a union. It also shouldn't be code word to pretend that everything is fine there and everything is working well. We have literally hundreds of thousands of employees, a bulk of them being veterans themselves, trying to deliver the best quality of care. But at times when something gets that big and we get supervisory responsibility between folks who are delivering the care, there can be some breakdowns. And this was an attempt to make sure that those who are doing their job right are able to continue to do that. They're continue to argue for safe working conditions, for fair wages, for better quality of care, and that those folks who are responsible for getting rid of those people have the tools to do so in a manner that is not overly burdensome. So I tell you, this bill does promote accountability. It gives the VA the tools we believe they need to get those bad employees, make them accountable while maintaining a constitutionally mandated workplace protections that shield good employees and whistleblowers from retaliation. One example of some compromises we made in it, it codifies the Office of Accountability and Whistleblower Protection. If some of you may recall, recently the President did an executive order on this, which was a bill that was bipartisan in this Congress. One of the things that we did was that the head of that office will be Senate-confirmed position as Assistant Secretary for Accountability. This is an important step to protect whistleblowers who often are the drivers of accountability and protects them from what could be perceived as political pressure on them. Smart move. It also requires the VA to evaluate supervisors based on their protection of whistleblowers. This is a common sense provision, aligns the incentives for supervisors to protect whistleblowers when they shed light on dangerous situations or problematic employees at the agency. The bill requires the VA to improve its training regarding whistleblower disclosure. We want to ensure that there are no excuses for employees at the VA to not know how to handle protected disclosures. Proper training will be a key to ensuring all employees, and not just supervisors, understand the importance of whistleblower protections. All of us and the concerns that we had wanted to make sure and understand that those collectively bargained rights are, again, we could have a philosophical discussion on it, but I believe are protections to ensure that we're able to keep and maintain the best quality workforce in the VA, making sure that they're able to deliver what's expected of them, which is quality care. It does, this bill, it maintains all existing due process protections in current law by ensuring there's a notice and opportunity to respond before an employee is fired. For example, while the bill changes some of the timelines for filing grievances, it nevertheless respects the grievance procedure in VA employees' collective bargaining agreement. That's called compromise. They should have the right. It's not an all or nothing. It takes too dang long before. They should have the right to be able to do that, but there's no reason it should drag out for years, causing problems, people getting paid when they're not doing the work. What we should be able to agree upon is they collectively bargained that it's there. We should speed it up, make it quick, and get a final decision and move on. If they're innocent, go back to work. If they're not, get a new job. That's what this was attempting to do. This bill improves the appeals process by requiring VA to provide an employee with a complete evidence file when they're fired, thereby empowering them to appeal sooner. Our veterans deserve an agency that serves them well. This bill will help do that. Time to bring real, long-lasting, and constitutional accountability measures to the Department of Veterans Affairs. I hope we can come together. I would encourage my colleagues to support this. I concur with the chairman's recommendation that this be a closed rule. This bill was brought, it was debated, it went over, we worked our will. There were differences when it left here, deep differences on certain issues, but with an understanding that's the way Congress works. It went to the Senate, some of those things were hashed out. It came back here. The chairman is compromising and going to support this. I'm compromising, going to support this, and I would encourage each of you to do so. As we all said, and I know this is the mantra you all have, I've said it since I've came here, I am the VA's staunchest supporter, but I will be their harshest critic when they need it. This bill allows us to give the tools to make sure that when that harshest critic needs to come out, they do so. But what I would tell you on this, as all of us know, accountability empowers good employees to feel safe in their workplace, to do better. And I said it, there's nothing, as a school teacher, I knew the person who was angriest at the bad teacher next door was the good teacher who was doing the work. But it didn't excuse that there needs to be due process. But once that's done, move people on. So I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I do want to make sure that I give credit where credit is due. This was Chairman Rowe's mission to get this. It was the top priority, one of the top 2 priorities of all the veteran service organizations in this country, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, at this point in time, every single one of them is supporting this compromise piece of legislation. So with that, I yield back.
Including you.
Including me. I fully support this piece of legislation. We'll be voting for it, and I would tell my colleagues who are concerned, I certainly wouldn't support this if I felt it was undermining the employee's right to be able to do what they needed to do. This streamlines those things. There are going to be those that are unhappy about that, but it needs to be done. So I think this is movement forward, and I would encourage all of us that this is a compromise. Again, a very challenging subject that the chairman said, I'm going to take it on, I'm going to take it head on, I'm going to take it head on early in this Congress, and we're going to get something done. This is the result of that, and I fully support it.
Thank you very much for your clear testimony. Mr. Cano, welcome back to the Rules Committee. As the gentleman knows, his opportunity to be before this committee is not only a cherished opportunity for him and his constituents, but something that we look forward to. The issues and the ideas that you bring us are important. Excuse me, the gentleman's recognized now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
And it's my high delight. I'm delighted to be here with my colleagues, Chairman Rowe, who I have a great regard for, not only as a doctor but also as a patriot and a veteran. Deep regard for my ranking member, Sergeant Major. I want to, Mr. Walls. So thank you. So I want to join my colleagues in support of this legislation. Throughout the debate over accountability at the Department of Affairs, this committee knows that I've advocated for legislation that holds VA employees accountable without violating their constitutional right to due process. The Department of Veterans Affairs Accountability and Whistleblower Protection Act strikes that balance far better than previous accountability proposals. Now, despite my concerns with with certain provisions, I support the legislation, and I believe it will help improve the quality of the quality of care that veterans receive. Now, the bill is far from perfect. It lowers the burden of proof required to terminate an employee. It shortens the time that employees have to respond to a disciplinary action. These 2 changes are more likely to infringe upon due process rights than support stronger accountability. But we should always remember that a third of VA employees are veterans themselves, and they deserve the workplace protections afforded to them in the Constitution, as well as the respect of this Congress. However, my concerns pale in comparison to the serious and numerous constitutional issues raised by accountability bills previously advanced in the House. Namely, this compromise does not dismantle collective bargaining agreements. It does not make unworkable changes to the appeals process, and it maintains key due process protections. The changes it does make will strengthen whistleblower protections and fix defects in the current law that make unaccountability provisions unenforceable in the courts. In passing this legislation, I hope we can shift our focus from who is fired from the VA to who is hired at the VA. Ultimately, the success of our bipartisan effort to reform the Department of Veterans Affairs will depend on recruiting, training, and retaining the highest quality talent available. Now, there are nearly 50,000 vacant jobs at the VA. This is a significant and urgent challenge. I look forward to working with my colleagues on the Veterans Affairs Committee to streamline the hiring process and to ensure the VA has the staff and expertise it needs to provide veterans the care and support they have earned. I applaud the Senate's work in forging this compromise, and I encourage my colleagues to support this legislation. So I thank the committee for the opportunity to testify, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Cano, thank you very much. Mr. Walsh, do you mind taking just a second to run through with us real quickly your career in representing the United States Army, the American people?
Thank you. And I said I am a sergeant, retired sergeant major in the Army National Guard. I'm an artilleryman, but I always like to tell the story when I went out to Walter Reed and they introduced me and they said, "This is Congressman Walls. He's a former sergeant major in the Army." This young Marine looked at me and said, "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that." And so I thought it was a Marine joke. He told me, he goes, "What are you sorry?" I asked him what he was sorry about, and he said, "I'm sorry you took the demotion to Congress, Sergeant Major." So I joined.
He didn't want to demean being Sergeant Major.
No, he didn't want to demean a Sergeant Major. No, I'm just proud. I joined when I was 17. My father was a Korean War veteran, and kind of what you did, and got the opportunity to serve, and started out as an infantryman at Fort Benning, and eventually figured out it was easier to ride in howitzers and shoot from a distance, and so joined that. Served in several states, National Guard, including in Texas, out of a Houston-based unit, and got to see beautiful Fort Hood, and retired when I decided to run for Congress after we deployed in 03 and 04 in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. But thank you for asking. And
thank you very
it's my
much.
passion for this issue of the VA, and I think I can't underestimate to all of you to let you know what a heavy lift this was. What a difficult lift. Mr. Takano being here has worked heavily with our public sector unions, who, as I may say, are wonderful employees trying to do good things. They're not super happy, but change needed to happen. And I think we struck that compromise, and I think as a veteran understand this and know most of those employees, or a good chunk of them are veterans themselves, we think this strikes the right compromise. And Chairman Rowe taking it on. This has been an issue that has been boiling around for decades, and no one really took on any real reform. And I think it needs to be said. There's certainly philosophical differences that the chairman, I think, maybe more things could have been done, but in the right spirit to get this done, is willing to compromise with us to get it there. And I hope we feel the same way, that needs to happen. Really important piece of legislation. And I would like to echo, the reason I think it's so important is I believe Dr. Shulkin is the right person at the right place at the right time and has the skill sets, and he believes this is going to make a difference. And I trust him on that. I trust him for what he believes and what he needs to get done.
Well, we have for many years heard a testimony about what I would politely call the woes of the industry, the woes of the entire system. And I will tell you that when General Shinseki took over, I had a private meeting with him and told him we had a problem. And I'm so glad through evolution we've gotten here. Too many people died at the hands of the VA.
And the part that I would, if I could just add, Mr. Chairman, is that every day, and we all know this here, that literally tens of thousands of quality VA employees go and deliver amazing care.
Every day.
And I represent the Mayo Clinic, who will tell you that the quality care at the Minneapolis VA Polytrauma Center would rival anything else. But when one person does this, or one person games the system and it becomes news, or one veteran dies sitting in their car instead of being seen, it undermines the entire system. So I think that's why, if you really do understand the mission of the VA, you really do understand that it is a core responsibility and it has to be there, and that there are literally tens of thousands of amazing things happening there, it's important we don't let these distract. And the Secretary believes this is a step forward.
Well, I will put it to all three of you. Thank you for working together. Working together beats the stuffings out of coming up here and arguing and fighting, and perhaps sometimes it's worthy of that. Today, you lived up to a success model. Thank you very much. Chairman Cole.
Thank you. I'm not going to take a lot of time because obviously we have broad agreement. I want to congratulate all three of you for achieving that. And also note, just picking up on something Mr. Waltz said, that's not unusual in this area. It's really not. We doubled spending on veterans under President Bush. We continued on exactly the same trajectory under President Obama. This has been an area where we've traditionally worked together. It's interesting to me as an appropriator. Last year, the only bill across the line in time and with a strong bipartisan vote was VA Milcon, and they're being marked up later this week. And so that process will begin again, and my guess is we'll hopefully get there again, I actually, in the course of this, thought all the debate was very legitimate. I actually voted for your amendment, Mr. Walsh, on the floor. I have a considerable number of federal employees, but I thought the bill was so important. I obviously voted for the total bill to be moved over, and I'm glad all three of you remained engaged and came back to us with a product that is genuinely bipartisan and generally will move us in the right direction while, I agree, protecting important constitutional protections for a workforce that 99% of whom really do care about this. My dad was a career, as we've talked about before, career master sergeant in the Air Force and spent the last 12 years of his life in veterans facilities with Alzheimer's, and he got exceptional care from the men and women that looked after him. And we are, as a family, forever grateful that obviously they were there, and frankly that the country kept its commitment that they'd made to him and to our family when he was in uniform. I'm just very proud of that, and proud of the United States for doing, we all in Congress hear our fair share of complaints, and that's legitimate. I never upset when somebody's calling my office to tell us something's not working out. That's our job to try and fix it. But I think sometimes we forget, again, how many things we do right. And I always tell people at town halls, we spend more money on veterans, not than any country in the world, than every country in the world combined. And I don't begrudge that. That's because that's how strongly this country feels about the men and women who, and it's an all-volunteer force, step forward to offer themselves to serve as the shield of the republic. So to see you come together and make sure we honor our commitments as a Congress, this speaks very well of all three of you. And I thank you very much for your excellent, excellent work and look forward in a very contentious age, at a very contentious time, to something this week that we will all be voting on in vast numbers together. That'll yield back, Mr.
Chairman Cole, thank you very much. The gentlewoman from New York. Gentlewoman does not seek time. Is there any other member of your side that would seek time?
Perhaps either of
Florida Judge Hastings.
Perhaps either of the members will answer this for me. It's my understanding that the bill will allow for the forfeiture of some employees' pensions under certain circumstances. Is that the case? And if so, if it's prohibited in the private sector, then why is it being allowed here?
Judge, it is, but it has to hit the forfeiture, and I can imagine this would be a very rare circumstance where the employees work. In other words, what they did, we've seen some examples, for instance, of people who, I guess, went the extra, how would you say it, Tim, mile, and shouldn't have bent the rules for their benefit. And that's basically what we're looking at, someone who would do that and then get a retirement. It may have been a crime they committed while they were working for the VA, that kind of thing.
Thank you, Dr. Rowe. Does the bill eliminate the ability of Merit System Protection Board?
No,
So the employees still will have
Yes, sir. That's
the
correct.
opportunity to have
That's
that
correct.
kick in. Everybody talks about their relatives. I had 3 uncles that served in the Army in the halcyon days of segregation. All 3 were wounded in combat, and only one of them got his Purple Heart, now that I think about it. But in any event, humorously, for you, Sergeant Major, when I went to college, I didn't know what a sergeant major was, and none of my uncles came home talking about sergeant majors and what have you. But there was a classmate of mine whose real name, and his family must have been thinking it through, was Sergeant Major General Heath. That was his real Sergeant Major General. I just thought about that. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman, just back his time. Thank you very much. Is there any other member of the committee that would seek time? The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
I just wanted to say I've been telling folks back home about your work on this all year long, and folks have said time and time again that they believed that our very profound differences would prevent us from getting anything like this done, and I shared with them at that time that they were underestimating our shared and profound commitment to making a difference in people's lives, and I just want you to know how much I appreciate that for our center there in Decatur, Georgia. Folks want to believe that the right outcome's going to happen, but it doesn't happen without our chairman on the Senate side, Georgia's own Johnny Isaacson, and our chairman and ranking member here. So thank you very much for what you've done.
Thank you very much. Any other member? The gentleman from Louisville, Texas, Dr. Michael Burgess.
Thank you, Chairman. Dr. Rowe, welcome to the Rules Committee. We want you back here frequently. You do such a great job. Sergeant Major Waltz, this is a rare occurrence, but I'm going to agree with you. I think Dr. Shulkin, Chairman Sessions knows this, for 10 years we have worried about and worried with the difficulty of Department of Defense medical records interfacing with VA medical records. And when Dr. Shulkin stood up and said, we are out of the software development business, I wanted to stand on my chair and cheer, because that was, it took a lot of courage for him to do that. But when, on that day, I became convinced that this was the transformational leader that we needed in charge of the VA. So you all three have a big task ahead of you. We are expecting great things, and we're actually expecting not to hear about problems in the future because of the work you're doing and the work you're doing today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. Gentleman yields back his time. I would amplify what the gentleman's talking about. Year after year, we receive testimony. We would talk about when the young chairman would come up, as well as the appropriations people, and we would ask about this issue. And it seemingly became a task larger than the ability to solve. We need people always to step up and do what's necessary.
If I could, and I appreciate Dr. Burgess pointing that out. I do think that, and it's you know, we kind of talk to ourselves, are the only ones here as members that might know this, but these two issues, the joint medical record and the use of Cerner and the decision to do that, and coming to an agreement on accountability piece across a broad spectrum, these are two landmark pieces of legislation. I think it's important to note, as I've said before when I've come up here, that always starts with somebody at the center of that, and my friend from Tennessee is the right man at the right time, again, at the right place, moved what I think are two, when we look back on this, I think are going to be two legacy pieces that when the transformation truly began, it started with that. So it is, I appreciate both of you noting that, but I think it's important to note that many have tried and many have sat in that chair on both sides of the aisle, and many have failed. We are on the cusp of both of these things going. So I'm proud to ride this ride with him. Thank you, Chairman.
Might I note the young man is an Eagle Scout also. Is there any other member
He was a major, but he was outranked by a sergeant major.
Is there any other member that would seek time? I want to thank all three of you, not only for your devotion to this important issue, but also the larger issue, and that is the veterans, the men and women, their families of this country, and those who actively serve, knowing that the other side of the coin is going to work for them also in their time of need. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well done. Congratulations.
Is there any other member that would seek time before the committee? S. 1094. Seeing none, this now closes the hearing portion, and the chairman would like to announce that as we clear the room, there were a number of people that were attending today who came from my personal office, including Houston Keene from Dallas, Texas, who is Baylor University, Alexandra Sherwood, class of 2019 from Sewanee, which is University of the South, Jeremy Hartley, a rising senior at St. John's University, Gavin O'Brien, a rising junior at Southern Methodist University, Mendel Litzman from Brigham University, Brent Weisberg from class of 2020, University of Pennsylvania, Mallory Davis from Clemson, the national champions, Liam Diebel, my stepson from Baylor University, Lauren Reed, a sophomore from St. Mary's University. We also have some others who joined us, including a Rules Committee intern who started today, Tim Rutley from Flint High School, and also two additional young students who are interning this summer and will be here with us all summer. The gentlewoman Katie Clary from Notre Dame University and Zam Sekar from St. Andrews University. I want to thank all these young students for taking time to come up to the Rules Committee to be a part of what we're doing. and to thank them and wish them the very best in their studies. Chairman, now be received a motion from the gentleman, the young chairman from Oklahoma.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H.R. 2581, the Verify First Act, the closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Ways and Means. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Ways and Means now printed in the bill shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instruction. Section 2 of the rule provides for consideration of S 1094, the Department of Veterans Affairs Accountability and Whistleblower Protection Act 2017 under a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Veterans Affairs. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the bill shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill. Finally, the rule provides one motion to commit.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the gentleman bringing the motion forward. The committee should note that this was the bill that was just discussed by the gentleman, the young chairman from Tennessee, Dr. Rowe. You've now heard the motion from the gentleman from Oklahoma, H.R. 2581, also known as S 1094, Department of Veterans Affairs Accountability and Whistleblower Protection Act 2017. There's an amendment or discussion on this.
Mr. Chair,
Oh, I'm sorry.
we're going to ask for a vote, not because of the bill, because of process again. We just are continuing one closed rule after another. And with, particularly since only one side of the House does any of the working on any of these bills without a whole lot of help. So we have no amendments on either of them, but I'd like to call for a vote on the 2581.
Discussion.
Yes,
Gentleman
briefly,
from
Mr. Chairman,
Florida.
I just ask unanimous consent to include in the record a statement opposing 2581 that carries the imprimatur of a significant number of organizations.
Want to put that in the record?
Thank you very much. Without objection, that'll be in the record. Further discussion. I'd like to note that the gentleman, the ranking member of the committee, did indicate specifically that he was in support of a closed rule also in his testimony before the committee. So you've now heard the amendment from the gentleman from New York. Those in favor of the slaughter amendment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. Noes have it, noes have it. Excuse me. Excuse me, did the gentlewoman?
I did, I said I'd
She
like
had
to
an
vote.
amendment.
Yes,
Just on the rule though, right?
on the rule. Yes.
Oh, excuse me, only on the rule, not on the open. I'm sorry, I heard you
No.
say to make.
I've
an
said
open
we are
rule.
calling for it because, not to do anything
Excuse me,
with, I
I'm
think, with
sorry.
the
I thought you
underlying
were-
bill.
I thought you were asking for an
But
open rule.
no, we are, but this is, we know we're not going to get one, so we just continue our votes on to show that one after another, all these bills are closed.
Okay.
Okay.
Would the gentlewoman clarify her request for the amendment?
I'm not asking for an amendment. I'm asking that we have a vote.
Gentlewoman does not seek, so she is simply saying on the vote on the rules of. how
That
she-
because it
Thank
is
you
a
very much.
closed
Thank you
rule,
very
we would
much.
like to have a vote.
So the vote will now be on the motion from the gentleman from Oklahoma. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
The ayes have it, the ayes have it. Accordingly, the gentleman,
Roll call. Oh,
gentlewoman asked for a roll call vote.
I don't see.
Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall. Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins, aye. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Byrne, aye. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse, aye. Mr. Buck. Mr. Buck, aye. Ms. Cheney. Ms. Cheney, aye. Ms. Slaughter.
No.
Ms. Slaughter, no. Mr. McGovern.
No.
Mr. McGovern, no. Mr. Hastings. No. Mr. Hastings, no. Mr. Polis. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk will report the total.
9 yeas, 3 nays.
The motion is agreed to. Gentleman from Windsor, Colorado, Mr. Buck will be handling this for Republicans.
And Mr. Hastings for the
Mr.
Democrats.
Hastings will handle this for Democrats. Thank you very much. Chairman now being received a motion for H.R. 2372, the Veterans Act.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H.R. 2372, the Veteran Act, a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Ways and Means. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Ways and Means, now printed in the bill, shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions of the bill as amended. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions. Section 2 of the rule provides for consideration of H.R. 2579, the Broader Options for Americans Act, under a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Ways and Means. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Ways and Means, now printed in the bill, shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. Finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions.
Thank you very much. You've now heard the motion on the gentleman from Oklahoma. Is there an amendment or discussion to that? Gentlewoman is recognized.
As we did before, we will simply ask for a vote because of the closed rule process.
Thank you very much. Any further discussion? Vote now be on the motion from the gentleman in Oklahoma. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
The ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Roll call, please.
Gentlewoman, that's a roll call vote.
Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins, aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne, aye. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Newhouse, aye. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck, aye. Ms. Cheney? Ms. Cheney, aye. Ms. Slaughter? Ms. Slaughter, no. Mr. McGovern? Mr. McGovern, no. Mr. Hastings? Mr. Hastings, no. Mr. Polis? Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk will report the total.
9 yeas, 3 nays.
The motion is agreed to. Accordingly, the gentleman, Mr. Cole, will be handling this for Republicans. Mr. McGovern will be handling this for Democrats. I need to notify us that our next meeting is scheduled for tomorrow at 3 o'clock. We'll be scheduled for H.R. 1215, the Protecting Access to Care of 2017. Is there further discussion before we adjourn for the day? No questions. This now finishes the work of the committee for the day. Thank you.